My name is Hannah Voss. I'm 29 years old. I work as a fraud investigator for a regional bank, specifically the department that reviews flagged documents, power of attorney forms, signature verifications, notarizations that don't quite add up. I've spent 6 years learning to spot the things that look right at first glance and fall apart the second you know where to look. On a Wednesday afternoon in March, I tried to transfer money out of my own trust account to pay a deposit on an apartment, and the transaction was declined. Not insufficient funds. A hold, account flagged pending review, the message said, due to a power of attorney filing received 11 days earlier. A power of attorney I had never signed, granting control of my $520,000 trust, money my grandfather left me, money that had been sitting untouched, growing quietly, since I was 18, to my parents. I sat in my car in the parking lot of my apartment building and read that notice 3 times. Then I did the thing 6 years of training has made automatic. I didn't call my parents. I didn't call a lawyer, not yet. I opened my laptop, logged into the bank's internal system using my own employee credentials, carefully, the way you're supposed to, documenting every step, and I pulled up the filing. There it was. A power of attorney document, my name, my signature, or something that was supposed to be my signature, a notary stamp from an office 2 towns over, one I had never set foot in, and 2 names listed as agents with full authority over my accounts, my mother, and my father. I want to be very clear about something before I tell you the rest of this story. I did not feel angry sitting in that car. I felt something closer to what I feel at work when a file crosses my desk that doesn't add up. A kind of focus. A narrowing. The feeling of a puzzle announcing itself. Because here's the thing about forged documents. Most people who forge them think the hard part is the signature. The signature is never the hard part. Stay with me. Because what I found in the next 72 hours is the reason I'm telling you this story at all. Subscribe. This gets worse before it gets better, and then it gets a lot better. Let me back up. Because this story didn't start with a declined transaction. It started 17 years ago, with a man named Walter Voss, who was my grandfather, and who understood something about my parents that took me most of my adult life to understand myself. My grandfather built a small chain of hardware stores across 3 counties, starting with one location his own father had run and growing it slowly and stubbornly into something that was worth real money by the time he was ready to retire. He sold the business when I was 12. I didn't know at the time what he did with the money. I just knew that my grandfather, who had always seemed comfortable but not flashy, suddenly seemed to have a lot of meetings with men in suits, and that my parents started talking about him differently, more carefully. The way you talk about someone whose opinion of you has started to matter in a new way. My grandfather died when I was 22, from a heart condition that had been managed for years and then, one ordinary Tuesday, stopped being manageable. I was in my last semester of college. I remember getting the call from my mother, and I remember, this detail has stayed with me for 7 years, that the first thing she said after telling me he'd passed was, "We need to talk about the will soon. There's a lot to sort out." I was 22, and my grandfather had just died, and my mother's first instinct was the paperwork. I didn't think much of it at the time. Grief does strange things to people, and I told myself that's all it was. My mother processing something enormous by retreating into logistics, the way some people do. The will was read about 3 weeks later. My grandfather had left the bulk of his estate, roughly $1.4 million after taxes, divided 3 ways. A third to my mother, his only child. A third to a charitable foundation that supported trade schools, which made sense, given his life. And a third, roughly $520,000, placed into an irrevocable trust for me, with instructions that I could not access the principal until I turned 30, though I could draw modest distributions for education and reasonable living expenses before then. I want to explain why he structured it that way. Because it matters for everything that came after, and because I only learned the real reason much later, in a way that made the whole story click into place at once. At the time, my parents told me, and I believed them, that my grandfather had set it up that way because he was old-fashioned, because he didn't think a 22-year-old should have access to that kind of money, because he wanted to make sure I did something with my life before I had a safety net that size. That explanation made sense. My grandfather had been old-fashioned. It fit. It was not the real reason. Comment the word hardware if you've ever found out, years later, that something you'd been told as a simple fact had actually been a careful, deliberate choice someone made for reasons nobody told you at the time. Stay with me. The real reason is coming, and it's the reason this entire story exists. For the first few years after my grandfather died, the trust was just a fact of my life, something that existed that I knew about, that I occasionally thought about when I was deciding whether to take an unpaid internship or whether I could afford to move to a more expensive city for a job. I drew small distributions twice, both times for genuinely reasonable things. Once to cover a gap in tuition my senior year, once to help with a security deposit when I moved for my first real job after college. Both times, I had to go through my parents. That was part of the trust structure too, until I turned 30. Distributions required a co-signature from one of the trust's named co-trustees, and my grandfather had named my parents as co-trustees, alongside the bank's trust department, which handled the actual administration. I didn't think much of this either at the time. It seemed like a reasonable safeguard. A 22-year-old probably shouldn't have unrestricted access to $500,000. And having a parent involved in approving distributions seemed, on its face, like exactly the kind of careful, old-fashioned protection my grandfather would have wanted. What I didn't think about, what it took me years to think about, was how my parents felt about that arrangement. About being, technically, gatekeepers to money that wasn't theirs, that they couldn't touch, that existed specifically because my grandfather had decided, for reasons unstated, that I needed a layer of protection around it. Protection from what? I never asked. I started my job at the bank when I was 23. It's a detail that matters, because it's the reason everything that happened later went the way it did. But at the time, it was just a job. A good one, with decent pay and a clear path forward, in a department that fascinated me from the first week. I'm the kind of person who likes finding the thing that doesn't fit. Always have been. My parents used to joke about it when I was a kid, that I was the only 10-year-old who'd notice if someone had moved a book half an inch on a shelf. Fraud investigation, it turned out, is just that instinct with a salary attached. Over the next 6 years, I got good at my job. Genuinely good. Promoted twice, given increasingly complex cases. Eventually moved into the department that handles exactly the kind of document I would. One Wednesday afternoon at 29, fine filed against my own accounts. During those 6 years, my relationship with my parents was fine. That's the honest word for it. Not close, not distant. We saw each other for holidays. My mother called every couple of weeks, conversations that were pleasant and slightly repetitive, the way conversations with parents often are once you're an adult living your own life. My father was quieter, always had been. The kind of man who showed affection through fixing things, through showing up with tools when you mentioned a leaky faucet, rather than through conversation. I want to be honest. I loved my parents. I still do, in the complicated way you love people whose actions you've come to understand differently than you used to. Nothing about this story is about not loving them. It's about what I found out and what I did about it. And the fact that those two things can both be true about the same people at the same time. The trust turned 30 in, well, I would turn 30 in about 14 months from the Wednesday I'm telling you about. 14 months until full, unrestricted access to $520,000, plus whatever it had grown to in 7 years of careful investment. I had started casually thinking about what I'd do with it. Nothing dramatic. A down payment on a place of my own. Eventually, maybe some of it invested further. I'd mentioned this in passing to my mother a few months earlier. Just mentioned it. The way you mention things to your mother? I didn't think anything of mentioning it. I think now, that mentioning it might have been the thing that started the clock. Comment the word clock if you've ever said something completely ordinary to someone, not realizing it had set something in motion that you wouldn't understand until much later. Subscribe. The forged document is next. And what I found when I pulled the file is the part of this story that still, honestly, takes my breath away. Sitting in my car in that parking lot, I did what I do at work. I opened a case file, not officially, not yet, just for myself, in a personal document, because documenting things is how my brain organizes a crisis. I wrote down the date, the time, the exact wording of the decline notice. Then I logged into the bank's system, using credentials I was absolutely authorized to use for my own job, and I pulled up the filing. The power of attorney document was 4 pages. Standard durable power of attorney language, broad authority over financial accounts, real property, the kind of document that's genuinely useful for, say, an elderly parent who needs someone to manage their affairs if they become incapacitated. Completely normal document. People file these every day for entirely legitimate reasons. Mine had my name at the top. My date of birth correct. My account numbers correct, which told me immediately that whoever had prepared this had access to information about my accounts that wasn't publicly available. And at the bottom of page 3, a signature. My signature. I want to describe what I felt looking at that signature, because it's the detail that I keep coming back to. It was close. Genuinely close. The kind of close that would absolutely pass casual inspection, that had, in fact, already passed the inspection of whatever notary had stamped it. The letters had the right general shape. The slant was approximately right, but I've spent 6 years looking at signatures. Real signatures have a quality that's almost impossible to fake. A kind of unconscious rhythm, the specific places where a pen speeds up or slows down, the pressure variations that come from years of writing your name the exact same way without thinking about it. Forged signatures, even good ones, are drawn. They're the product of someone looking at a sample and copying it, consciously, stroke by stroke. And copying, no matter how careful, produces a signature that's too even. Too deliberate. The forger is thinking about every letter. The real signer isn't thinking about any of them. This signature was too even. I pulled the notarization details next. A notary named Patricia Renfrew, with a stamp registered to an office in Millbrook, a town about 40 minutes from where I lived, where I had never been, working with a notary I had never met, for a document I had never signed. Notaries are required, by law, to witness a signature in person and verify identity, typically with a government-issued ID, which meant one of 2 things. Either Patricia Renfrew had notarized a document for someone she believed was me, presenting some form of identification, meaning someone had impersonated me, in person, with a fake or stolen ID, or Patricia Renfrew had notarized a document without actually following the verification process at all, which happens more often than people realize, especially with notaries who are themselves employees of a larger office and who process dozens of documents a day without much scrutiny. I made a note, check Renfrew's notary log. Cross-reference with my actual whereabouts on the filing date. The filing date was 11 days earlier. I pulled up my own calendar. On that date, I had been at work, at the bank, the same institution where this document was now filed, from 8:15 a.m. to 6:40 p.m., with badge swipe records to prove every entry and exit, because that's how our building works. I had not been within 40 minutes of Millbrook. I had not been anywhere near a notary's office. I had spent that entire day at my desk reviewing, as it happened, 2 other flagged documents that had nothing to do with me. The power of attorney had been filed at 2:14 p.m. that day. At 2:14 p.m., I had been in a meeting with my supervisor, discussing a different case entirely. There were 4 other people in that meeting. There was a calendar invite. There was a conference room booking. I sat in my car and felt the puzzle pieces start to align, the way they do at work when a case that seemed complicated suddenly isn't. When you realize the entire structure of something rests on an assumption that's simply, provably, untrue. Whoever had done this had access to my account information, my date of birth, enough personal details to fill out a convincing form. They had found a notary willing to stamp a document without verifying identity properly, or willing to look the other way. And they had done it on a day when I had an airtight, badge-logged, calendar-confirmed alibi for the exact time the document was filed. They had also, and this is the part that made everything click, listed themselves, both of them, as the agents under the power of attorney. My mother and my father. I sat in that parking lot for a long time, and then I called my supervisor. Not my parents. My supervisor. Comment the word alibi if you've ever realized in real time that the proof of your innocence in something already existed, you just hadn't needed it yet. Stay with me. What my supervisor said next is the moment this stopped being a personal problem and became something much bigger. Subscribe, because the next 72 hours moved faster than anything I'd experienced in 6 years of this job. My supervisor's name is Diane Okafor. She's been doing fraud investigation for almost 20 years, and one of the things I've always respected about her is that she doesn't get rattled. Not by big numbers. Not by ugly cases, not by the moments when a fraud case turns out to involve someone the victim actually knows, which in my experience is most of them. People think fraud is strangers. Mostly it's family. I called her from the parking lot. I told her as clearly and factually as I could what I'd found. The declined transaction, the filing, the signature, the notary in Millbrook, my badge records for the filing date and time. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Okay, first, are you safe? Is there any reason to think this escalates to anything physical?" I said I didn't think so. My parents weren't. I didn't think they were dangerous, not in that sense. Just wrong. In a way I was still trying to understand. She said, "Okay, second, I need you to understand that you cannot investigate this yourself. Not officially. You're the victim here, which means everything you've already found, while completely understandable, creates a conflict of interest the moment this becomes a formal case. So here's what we're going to do. What we did was this. Diane assigned the case, officially, to a colleague of mine named Robert Sung, someone I'd worked alongside for years, someone meticulous and unhurried in exactly the way you want a fraud investigator to be. I gave Robert everything I had. My badge logs. The calendar invite for the 2:14 p.m. meeting with the 4 other attendees, all of whom could confirm I'd been there. A formal statement given the same afternoon, describing the signature discrepancies I'd noticed, phrased carefully as observations, not conclusions, because that's how you're trained to phrase things, when you might end up testifying about them later. And separately, this is the part that moved fast. The bank's internal fraud team flagged the filing for immediate review, independent of anything I'd found, simply because a $520,000 trust had just had a power of attorney filed against it 11 days prior with a signature that, once a second analyst looked at it blind without knowing whose account it was, got flagged within about 4 minutes as warranting further verification. Within 24 hours, the bank had placed a formal hold on any transactions under the disputed power of attorney, not just declining my transaction, but freezing any activity at all under that document. Pending verification, within 48 hours, Robert had pulled Patricia Renfrew's notary log for the filing date. There was an entry. My name. A notation that identification had been verified. A driver's license, number recorded. The license number on the notary log did not match my actual driver's license number. It was close. 1 digit different. Robert ran the number that was actually recorded. It came back to a license that had been reported lost 3 years earlier by a woman named Carol Voss, my mother. Comment the word license. If you've ever watched a small detail, 1 digit, 1 name, 1 date, turn out to be the thread that the entire thing unravels. From.subscribe. What happened when Robert and I went to talk to Patricia? Renfrew is next, and it's the part of this story where everything I thought I understood about my family got Rearranged, here's what we pieced together. Over the next several days, through a combination of the notary log, banking records, and eventually Patricia Renfrew herself, who, once she understood the seriousness of what she was potentially implicated in, became extremely cooperative extremely quickly. Patricia Renfrew's notary office in Millbrook does a high volume of document notarizations for a local document preparation service, the kind of place that helps people fill out wills, powers of attorney, basic estate paperwork, often for a flat fee, often quickly, often without much scrutiny because most of what comes through is exactly what it appears to be. 11 days before my declined transaction, 2 people had come into that office. A woman, presenting a driver's license with the name Carol Voss, my mother's actual name, her actual license, the one she'd reported lost 3 years earlier and which, it turned out, had never actually been lost. And a second person, a man, who Patricia described when shown a photo later as matching my father's general description, though she hadn't been asked to verify his identity at all, because the document only required notarization of one signature, mine. The me who signed the document was not the woman presenting Carol Voss's license. Patricia's notes were vague on this point initially. It had been a busy day, she said. She notarized a dozen documents that morning. But eventually, under more careful questioning, she remembered something specific. She remembered that the woman who signed as Hannah Voss had been wearing a baseball cap, low, and had kept her head down through most of the interaction, and had signed quickly. Almost too quickly, Patricia said in retrospect, though at the time it hadn't registered as unusual, because people sign documents quickly all the time. Patricia had not asked for a second ID to verify the person signing as Hannah Voss. The office's procedure technically required it. In practice, when one person in a pair presents a valid ID for the account holder side of the transaction, in this case, Carol Voss presenting her own real ID, the notary's attention often goes there, and the second signer gets less scrutiny, especially if they're presented as, say, the account holder's daughter, there to sign her own document, accompanied by her mother. Nobody had impersonated me with a fake ID because nobody had needed to. The notary simply hadn't checked. What we still didn't know at this point was who the woman in the baseball cap actually was. Robert and I had a theory. We didn't say it out loud to each other for almost a full day, even though I think we'd both arrived at it independently, because it was the kind of theory that, once said out loud, changes how you see everything that comes after. The theory was it didn't matter who she was. What mattered was that my parents had found someone. A friend. A relative. Someone willing to do this for them. Or perhaps paid to do it. Who was roughly my height, roughly my build, willing to wear a hat and keep her head down and sign a name that wasn't her own in front of a notary who wasn't paying close attention. And the reason it didn't matter who she was the same reason the signature on the document was too even, too careful, too deliberately drawn, because somebody had practiced it. Comment the word practice. If you've ever realized that something that seemed spontaneous, a moment, a document, a decision, had actually been prepared, carefully in advance by someone who'd had time to get it right. Stay with me. The confrontation is next. I'd been calm for 5 days. This is the part where I stopped being calm, and the part where I finally understood why my grandfather had set up the trust the way he did. 5 days after the declined transaction, I drove to my parents' house. I want to explain why I waited 5 days because I think it matters. It wasn't because I was scared or because I needed time to calm down. By this point, I was past the angry stage, in the strange way that fraud investigation teaches you to be. I waited because Robert and the bank's legal team needed those 5 days to do things properly, to gather the evidence, to formally void the power of attorney filing through the bank's internal process and a notification to the county recorder's office to make sure that whatever happened next, the financial situation itself was already completely resolved, regardless of what conversation came after it. By the time I drove to my parents' house, the trust was no longer frozen. The forged power of attorney had been formally flagged as fraudulent with the county. A notice of fraudulent filing had been recorded, which is a real thing. A public record that essentially stamps a document as void and explains why, and my $520,000, plus the modest gains of the past several days, sat exactly where it was supposed to, accessible only to me and the actual trustees, as it always had been. I drove to my parents' house not to fix anything. The fixing was already done. I drove there because I wanted to ask them why. My mother opened the door. She looked for just a moment, surprised to see me. And then something else moved across her face. Something I'd later think of as the exact expression of someone realizing that a clock they'd been quietly listening to had just run out. "Hannah," she said. "What a surprise," I said. "Can I come in? I need to talk to you both about something." We sat in the living room, the same living room I'd grown up in, the same couch, the same arrangement of family photos on the wall that included, prominently, a picture of my grandfather, taken at his hardware store decades earlier, smiling in front of a wall of paint cans. I said, 11 days ago, someone filed a power of attorney against my trust account. It had my name on it and a signature that wasn't mine, notarized by someone in Millbrook who never verified the identity of the person signing. The person who filed it identified herself using my mother's driver's license, the one reported lost 3 years ago. And the 2 agents listed on the document, with full authority over my $520,000, were the 2 of you? The silence in that living room lasted longer than I can adequately describe. My father, who almost never speaks first in any conversation, spoke first. He said, "Hannah, I think you should let us explain." I said, "I'd like that. That's why I'm here." My mother's hands were folded in her lap, very still, the way mine probably looked in the courtroom of every story I'd ever investigated. The stillness of someone deciding, in real time, how much of the truth to give. My father said, "Your grandfather didn't trust us, Hannah, with money." He never said it directly, but it's why the trust was structured the way it was. Why we were named co-trustees but couldn't access anything ourselves. Why everything required your signature plus a co-trustee. Why it was locked until you turned 30. He knew that we'd struggled financially at different points. Before you were born and a little after. Nothing dramatic, but enough that he didn't trust us not to use it. If it were available to us. I said, "Okay." So he set it up carefully. That's not new information. I always knew the structure was careful. My mother said quietly, "What you didn't know is that we're in trouble again. Real trouble. Your father's business, the inventory financing, there's a loan and the terms changed. And the bank that holds it is calling it due, and if we can't cover it, we lose the business and probably the house. We've been trying to figure out how to manage it for almost a year. And then you mentioned, a few months ago, that you'd been thinking about what to do with the trust once you turned 30. And She stopped. I said, "And you decided that instead of asking me, you'd take it." Neither of them said anything. I said, "I would have helped. If you'd told me you were in trouble, actual trouble, the house, the business, I would have helped. 14 months early isn't nothing, but it's not. I would have found a way." "You didn't have to do this," my father said very quietly. "We know." And that was the moment I finally understood my grandfather. Not the structure of the trust. I'd understood that for years in the abstract. The careful old man protecting his granddaughter's money from people who might not be careful with it. What I understood, sitting in that living room, was that my grandfather hadn't been protecting the money from some hypothetical future risk. He had watched my parents, for years, make exactly this kind of choice. Small ones, probably over decades. The kind of choices that don't become a federal case, but that add up to a pattern. The pattern I investigate for a living without ever having recognized it in my own family. And he had built a trust specifically, deliberately, to survive that pattern. To survive them. Even after he was gone. He hadn't told me because telling a 22-year-old, "I don't trust your parents with money," is its own kind of damage, the kind he probably didn't want to do to me on top of everything else. So instead, he just built something that didn't need me to know. A structure that would hold, whether I understood it or not, for as long as it needed to. It had held. For 7 years, right up until the year before it was set to release, the exact moment when my parents, desperate, had decided the structure could maybe, somehow, be gotten around. It couldn't. My grandfather had made sure of that too, in a way none of us had needed to test until now. The co-trustee structure with the bank meant that even a successful, forged power of attorney wouldn't have given my parents direct access. It would have required the bank's trust department to act on it, which would have triggered exactly the kind of review that happened anyway. Just faster because of who I happened to work for, and what I happened to be trained to notice. My grandfather built a vault. And then, almost as an afterthought, he put the person who'd grow up to be the best person in the family at noticing forged signatures inside it, without anyone, including me, realizing that's what he'd done. Comment the word vault if you've ever realized that someone who loved you protected you from something. Years in advance, without ever telling you what they were protecting you from, because telling you would have hurt more than the protection itself. Stay with me. What happened after that conversation is the last part of this story. I want to tell you what didn't happen, because I think it matters as much as what did. I didn't press charges. I want to be honest about how close that decision was. Robert and the bank's legal team made clear that I had every right to, that the evidence was more than sufficient, that forging a notarized legal document and impersonating someone to a notary are serious crimes, regardless of who's involved. Robert told me carefully that the choice was entirely mine, and that he'd support whatever I decided, and that he understood, better than most people would, exactly how complicated whatever I decided actually was. I sat with it for almost 2 weeks. In the end, I made a different choice. I told my parents that I wouldn't pursue criminal charges, but that I wasn't going to pretend nothing had happened, either, and that there were going to be consequences, just not the kind that involved a courtroom. The first consequence was that they told me who the woman in the baseball cap was. It was my mother's sister, my Aunt Renee, who I'd always been close to, who lived 2 states away, who I called occasionally and saw maybe twice a year, and who, it turned out, had driven 6 hours and worn a baseball cap and signed my name in front of a notary because my mother had asked her to. And because, Renee told me this herself later, in a phone call that was one of the hardest conversations of my life, because my mother had told her I already knew. Had told her this was something I'd agreed to, a way of getting early access to my own money with my own knowledge, just without the paperwork delay. Renee had believed that. She'd had no idea she was committing fraud. She thought she was helping her niece cut through bureaucracy. When I called her and explained what had actually happened, there was a very long silence, and then Renee said, "Oh my God, Hannah," in a voice that told me immediately and completely that she was telling the truth, that my mother had used her, the same way she'd tried to use the document, the same way she'd used a driver's license she'd claimed was lost for 3 years. Renee was horrified. She offered immediately to go back to Patricia Renfrew, to give a full statement, to do whatever was needed to make sure she wasn't implicated in something she hadn't known she was part of. I told her the document had already been formally voided, that the bank's process had handled it, and that as far as I was concerned, she wasn't the person who owed anyone an explanation. That's the second thing that happened. My relationship with my Aunt Renee, which had always been warm but distant, became, and still is, one of the closest relationships in my family. We talk every week now. She came to visit 2 months after all this, and we spent an entire weekend not talking about any of it, the way you do with someone who's become important to you for reasons that have nothing to do with the thing that brought you closer. The third thing, the thing with my parents, is the part I find hardest to talk about, because it's the part that's still unfinished. In a way, the rest of this isn't. I told them I needed time. Not dramatically, not as a punishment, just honestly. I told them that I loved them, and that I understood, in a way I genuinely did, the desperation that had led to this. Losing a business, possibly a house. The particular terror of watching something you've built for decades come apart because of a loan you can't restructure. I'm not a person without empathy. I see every day what financial desperation does to people. The choices it makes feel reasonable in the moment that look completely different from outside. But I also told them, and this was the hardest sentence I've ever said to either of them, that I now understood why my grandfather built the trust the way he did. And that understanding it had changed something in how I saw both of them, in a way that wasn't going to unchange just because we'd had one conversation in a living room. I've seen them 4 times in the 8 months since. Each visit has been a little easier than the one before. My father in particular has called more, has asked about my life in ways he didn't used to, has been, in small unspoken ways, trying to be present in a way that feels like an apology, even though neither of us has said the word. My mother is harder. I think my mother is still, in some part of herself, waiting for this to become something we don't talk about. The way so many things in families become things nobody talks about. I don't think that's going to happen, not entirely. But I also don't think I need it to become a permanent rupture. I think it's going to be something we carry, differently than we carried things before for a long time. As for the trust, it released in full 4 months ago, when I turned 30. $520,000 plus 7 years of careful growth, accessible to me exactly the way my grandfather designed it to be, exactly on schedule. Completely unaffected by 11 days in March when someone tried to take a shortcut around a vault that had been built 15 years earlier. By a man who never told anyone what he was protecting or why, or how carefully. I used some of it for the down payment I'd originally been trying to make, the Wednesday this all started. I used some of it, more than I originally planned, to help my parents with the business loan. Not the whole thing. Enough to buy them time. Structured the way my grandfather would have structured it, with paperwork, with terms, with a co-signature requirement that means this time, everyone involved actually knows what they're signing. I signed it myself, in person. With my actual ID, comment the word designed. If you believe that the people who love us best sometimes show it in ways we don't understand until much later, sometimes years later, sometimes only after something goes wrong, and the careful thing they built finally has to do the job it was quietly built. 4. Welcome back to Lily Drama Stories, where the quietest person at the table is usually the one who already knows exactly what's in the will, the trust, and the vault, because someone a long time ago made sure she would. Here's what I want you to take from this story. My grandfather never had the conversation that would have made all of this simple. He never sat me down and said, I don't fully trust your parents, so I'm building something that will protect you even after I'm gone. That conversation would have been honest, and it would have been useful. And it also would have been one of the hardest things he ever said to me. And he chose, instead, to do the hard thing quietly, structurally, in a way that didn't require either of us to say the painful sentence out loud. I don't know if that was the right choice. I think about it a lot. Part of me wishes he'd told me, wishes I'd had 15 years to understand my parents the way I understand them now, instead of having it arrive all at once in a living room after a forged document and a 5-day investigation. But part of me also understands why he didn't. Some protections work better when the person being protected doesn't know they need protecting, not because the knowledge would be too much to handle, but because living without that knowledge, for as long as possible, is its own kind of gift. I got 15 years of believing my parents were simply careful people, before I had to learn they were something more complicated than that. My grandfather gave me those 15 years, on purpose, at the cost of never being able to explain why. If there's something you're quietly protecting someone from, a truth, a risk, a person, I don't know what the right answer is. whether to tell them now or build something that will hold even if you never do. I don't think there's one right answer. I think it depends on the person, and the truth, and what they're able to carry, and when. But I will say this. If you build something carefully enough, and you build it with enough love it can hold, for 15 years, for longer, and even after you're gone, even if the person it's protecting never finds out why, until exactly the moment they need to, drop a comment below. Tell me your word. Hardware, clock, alibi, license, practice, vault, or designed, whichever one hit you hardest.